It's too bad Peter's not here. I wanted to talk about trains and perspective. So it's perhaps good that Yoedat went before me and just talked, because I'm going to return to text. And the text of a text, so my text, which is not a citational reading of, or a paraphrastic reading of Rosenzweig's text, but a close reading in the sense that Martin gave us. And so I'd like to say just a few remarks about the formation of my perspective and my contribution to the project. So so if we can think in terms of these global images, the book, and this is a question I have about the face cover of the book. So if we're in a satellite going around the Earth, right, and we look down on our production and we see a book that we've created, is this going to be the cover of our book? The picture of Rosenzweig's death mask, right? Is that going to be the cover of our book? Because that's all we would see is just this one image as we flash by in the satellite, right?
This is a cover of the first edition of the second housing.
Yeah, okay, yeah. But I mean, we could plagiarize that. Or, to return to the images Martin and Peter set out, are we intent on creating this map for beginners that we can see from a Flugzeug, from an airplane, right? And what I'd like to say is my work comes from I'm going to be shameful here and talk about the book I just published. So the work for my part comes from chapter 2 of my book, where I talk about creation and Rosenzweig's work in the Star of Redemption out of that. And this is actually the kind of work that's geschichtsphilosophisch, has the vehicles of reference that are important for our scholarly work. And it's kind of like being in the train with Rosenzweig. Kind of being in the train and riding along with Rosenzweig and checking out the landscape as I'm riding along with Rosenzweig. But really how I see this work is somewhere between the Hubschrauber and the Flugzeug, somewhere between the helicopter and the airplane, because an airplane goes a little bit too fast, right? But a helicopter kind of dwells with some points, right? And we can see the lines a little bit better of the kind of work that we're doing. All right, so having said that, I tried very much to stay within the 25,000 characters that I thought we were supposed to work within, which Peter told us about. So I actually prepared 2 talks, and I'll give the one that's 25,000 characters. So the other one is 30,000 characters, and that includes references, like a few more citations, and I had to leave out or chop out the references to Islam. And that was interesting that we ended with that as well, because I feel a little bit guilty about leaving that out. So I just want to provide that by way of apology. The other point I want to make is I'm going to just speak nur auf Englisch, und ich könnte Fragen auf Deutsch dann nachher antworten, und aber English. So, this book begins in a familiar yet strange way. It is familiar in how Rosenzweig immediately takes up an already established narrative from the Bible through simply repeating the statement that God spoke. It is strange, however, because the first thing he draws our attention to in the phrase God spoke is how it expresses a temporal condition. It occurs in the form of the grammatical past tense, whose content refers us to a previously silent and invisible, because interior, act of the will. That act is one of the strangest and most mysterious of all acts, namely the act of creation. To create something new, for example, something literally out of nothing, entails putting into motion a powerful expression of spontaneous willfulness. As Rosenzweig notes, this spontaneous expression of what constitutes something totally new, that is, that we speak about something that was created out of nothing, is understandable as the apparently miraculous prophecy of a process that has become a visible actuality. And that process is the process of our experiencing anything at all. The very fact of communicating an understanding of our experiencing anything at all and having that be understood by another is a novelty of human community only able to be enacted through speech. Because how we talk to each other refers us to our experience of things in the world. To better understand this point, Rosenzweig distinguishes between a creator, in this case, the creator from the biblical story called God, and whatever it is that a creator creates. In order to do that, however, Rosenzweig says that we have to better understand what speaking itself is all about. As a visible actualization, the process of speaking itself becomes a miraculous beginning. Initially, as it becomes visible in its actualization, it is miraculous in the sense that Rosenzweig has already delineated, namely, it is something about which we can wonder and marvel. It is an actually existing something that is not me or simply an element of my psychological makeup. To make his point and to get to his next point about separating the act of a creator and the creation itself as something other than the creator, Rosenzweig returns to his earlier metaphysical discussion from Book 1, Part 1, about negation and affirmation in their immediate relation to their origin in the nothing. Here at the beginning of Part 2 of his book, the Buch der Stern, Rosenzweig more strongly emphasizes the non-dialectical character of the relation of these two moments. That is, the moment of speaking as a moment of communication between two humans correlated with the moment of creation as the relationship of creator to creature or created thing. The process is not dialectical, but is one of confrontation, of a Begegnung, and thus happens as a meeting of two opposites that creates a transformation. This most significant of all transformations originates as an inner struggle of negation with its achievement of a defining sense of self-freedom to an outwardly directed expression of positive freedom. And at this point, I don't have anything to pass out. What I had intended to do was to pass out some pictures of Rosenzweig's metaphor, Rosenzweig's image of packing and unpacking a suitcase, right? So if that would be suitable for a book for Anfänger, I would like to include something like that. With the metaphor of packing and unpacking, Rosenzweig prepares us for his claims about the nature of undergoing any experience whatsoever. Namely, that the actual empirical experience of packing this or that thing in a suitcase changes the order of how we understand and thereby interpret things when we unpack them. This means that our understanding is conditioned by the fact that at one time in my life, I experienced something one way, like putting clothes into a suitcase, and that another time later in my life, I experienced those contents otherwise, as I removed them in a reordered fashion, as I experienced removing them in a reordered fashion from the suitcase. In other words, I do not experience things as the self-same things over time because temporal and spatial intuitions, to borrow some Kantian terms, are filters for our dynamic experiences that do not allow us to reduce those experiences to a timeless account that could be repeated in an endless loop of identical iterations. The correlation of analyzing the process of speaking with the process of creating enables Rosenzweig to talk about God's self-expression, visible now through how he conceptualizes God's speech act, that is, that God created. Such a speech act is the beginning of God shining forth in self-expression. This shining forth is the self-expression of God's structure, God's configuration, and is God's essential attribute. But what more precisely does it mean to express oneself as shining forth? Shining forth has to do with the power of self-expression that becomes how more than one of us understands or sees the experience of moving from spontaneous and willful caprice, Willkür, to the peacefulness of enduring essence that Rosenzweig traces in his description of how one, as subject, expresses one's essential nature as creator. Through talking about the relationship of a creator and speech, Rosenzweig explicates how self-expression is a visible process, not as deed, but as essence. It is visible as essence in the way that its existence as self-expression can be seen and eventually heard through the very act of speaking that becomes the tangible marker of a prior willful act. To put it simply, the very act of speaking embodies in its expressive shining forth the wisdom that is the experience of having done something, of having created something. More concretely, Rosenzweig explicates the expressive act of the shining forth of an experience through a complex analysis of necessary versus freely spontaneous acts, versus free spontaneous acts. He notes that God must create, like the artist, in order to satisfy a divine need within himself, namely, in order to set the burden of loneliness within himself free. And while to be free it is necessary to create, Rosenzweig notes that there cannot be even one drop of passion in this creative act, neither a yearning to love nor a Maimonidean sort of overflowing love. Because if creation happened out of such a need, then the created thing would lose its own independence. The world, for example, would lose its elemental characteristic of independent createdness, its having been created at one time, and its character of having been left on its own to develop as it will. For this reason, Rosenzweig returns to the notion of caprice, Willkür, noting that it is not merely a cornerstone, but the very foundation stone for any theory of creation. But now caprice, Willkür, has to be reinterpreted to fit Rosenzweig's narrative structure, not as a fixed attribute, but as a dynamic occurrence that, quote, burned with ceaselessly renewed flame in God's bosom before creation, end quote. A flaming caprice with which the Creator vitalizes himself within himself, and which occurs as miraculous creative power. This creative power manifests itself in serene vitality, but at the base of that power is unconditionally free caprice. That is, that which is within is not necessity, but radically free caprice, not passionate need, understood as a completing or clinging kind of love, but simply an expression of inner freedom. To summarize, at this point, Rosenzweig begins the chapter by asking us to think about a very specific kind of speech act. That is, he begins by providing us with a speech act that is a form of speech thinking that syntactically occurs in the past tense, but that semantically refers us to a historical and philosophical narrative about how to think about God as a creator God, the grammatical subject of the phrase, God created. This leads us to consider how to speak about what it means to create something at all, namely, how to speak about what it means to bring something into existence, and for that something to exist. The project is a metalinguistic exercise that leads us to the thought of how that something could be the world as an existing entity consisting of a plethora of particulars that must ever be renewed to maintain their enduring, transitory existence. Then I lay that out. To be distinctive is to be counted as a chaotic particular, willfully involved in a process of creative self-transformation that negates all others. This is what Rosenzweig means when referring to the particulars birthed out of the world itself, represented by the essential nature of this or that universal species. But the particular also retains traces of its origination out of the universal essence, and thus retains the character of that essence itself. Thus endowed, it is not merely logically deduced from its source. Rather, it is endowed with existence and can be counted as an existing particular individual. This picture of a plastic, dynamic world in Rosenzweig's account is universal, but it is not always and everywhere because it is constituted through particularity, and so must constantly become new in order to continually to contain this concrete particularity called existence. But in order to continue to contain its concrete existence, its character of absolute empiricism, the world must continually undergo a necessary process of transformation, birthing absolutely free and arbitrarily willful, ever-new particulars or existence that crystallize as they grow older to form a completion in death as a denial of life, fixed with the character of thingliness. Upon completion of this specific form, the form of an ephemeral denial of enduring life, new particulars emerge, constantly denying the stability of the world, and yet ever becoming that stability again, and so on. This is also a way to understand the dynamism of the entire structure of Rosenzweig's book, with its symbolic configuration as a Star of David. I won't go into that here because there's not enough characters available. Rosenzweig adopts an old term, providence. He spells it out himself with the term providence, and coins a new one, creature consciousness, in order to suggest the logical and aesthetic differences between his account of the world process and idealist accounts. On providence, he says, the divine grasp of existence does not occur in creation, which took place once and for all. Rather, it is a momentary grasp, a providence that, though universal, renews itself with every smallest distinctive moment for the whole of existence in such a way that God, day by day, renews the work of beginning. End quote. That was a quote. And it is this very consciousness of creatureliness, that radically differentiates humans from other life forms, because that consciousness gives us a capacity for aesthetic presentation. Humans speak in different ways with each other. That includes creating works of art that renew the world through speaking and other forms, from the particularity of one human in commonality with other humans. The distinction between life forms is accentuated for Rosenzweig in differentiating between the dead language form of mathematics and the living grammatical distinctions of spoken language. Obviously, we have kinds of laws that take the form of rules of logic, namely premises, deductions, inferences, and conclusions that can be modeled mathematically. But there are also kinds of laws of grammar that result from investigating the emergence of hearable root words from what Rosenzweig introduced earlier as the silent source words, whose relationship to mathematics is formal but tangential. The source words are yes, no, and they function as variables in a differential calculus that corresponds to his model of the hypothetical structures of the pre-world. Those hypothetical structures enable us to think about any one of the three primary elements of reality according to their respective logics: God, world, human. But they don't enable us to speak with each other about them. What makes Rosenzweig's philosophy distinctive and still compelling is how he correlates the logic or laws of grammar with a midrash on the story of creation, claiming that through the familiarity of a re-narrated and newly interpreted traditional narrative, we can better understand how words work and how and why they occupy the space they do in the sentences composed of them. That is, we can better understand, through using and renewing such narrative histories in this narrative, why we choose and use the words that we do in creating or not creating understandings in our intersubjective relations. Said otherwise, the grammar of the words and sentences in this narrative can be related to the emergence of particulars in creation as a way of accounting for the renewal of the unconquerable and anarchic dimension of the chaotic, spontaneous freedom at the root of human distinctiveness. Words as such are related to creation as such, because what we say about creation and about the world also has to do with things and the space that they occupy. The sensual nature of words, both written and spoken, makes them the special case of being both thing-like, having to do with world space, and temporal and ephemeral, that is, speech. Speech includes an essentially chaotic dimension that is open to change over time. But in order to really catch the sense that chaos plays in our speech acts, we must begin with sentences, not words, says Rosenzweig. To make his case, Rosenzweig employs a Sprachdenken analysis of the syntax and semantics of the adjective, the Eigenschaftswort, as the grammatical analogy for the particular nothings of creation. He moves our attention from the relationship of an adjective with its initial indefinite case to the noun as the carrier of adjectives, to the pronoun this. The underlying logic is deductive. Namely, to understand anything in particular, we must first be given and then understand something in general. Such is the sentence. Such is also the world. The indefinite and inherently comparative nature of the adjective, this, points us towards the fact that a something should be sought as a concrete, definite referent. Moreover, along with the this is implied a spatial indicator, the here, which entails that space is posited as the universal condition under which the definite thing, so far only an undefined something, is to be sought. Given the initial evaluative affirmation of the adjectival attribute, we are led by logical inference to consider the noun and then the pronoun, which consequently points us to space as the dimension of objectivity and the general nominative space called thinghood, where we find actual things in the world. Guided then by grammatical structures and the use of our everyday language, we are determined to seek out things in the general context of their thinghood as that which constitutes the space of the world in which we live, psychophysiologically. For example, in getting us from using an indefinite adjective to a more definite sense of substantiality of the general predicate space called thinghood, is important because of the apparent problem that in any speech act, an individual adjective is merely one of many that could be used, indicating that there is an unacknowledged plurality always at work in our speech acts. This is related to what Rosenzweig earlier referred to as the complex ordering problem of the perhaps. In the context of the set of language practices as a whole, however, we have more than just sentences composed of variables. Indeed, adjectives can also become definite by being affixed to a definite article. As Rosenzweig notes, quote, fixed by the definite article, the adjective is a definite affirmed thing in the endless space of cognition or creation, end quote. What makes Rosenzweig's account special is that he correlates this syntactical arrangement as a semantic analog to his creation thinking, such that when we realize how the adjective, quote, comes to rest, end quote, as a grammatical object in the sentence and stands free and affirmed, we can, by analogy, think about how the created stuff of creation stands in an objective relationship, free and affirmed to the creator. But to truly understand how the world is a created thing, Rosenzweig tells us that we have to understand how it is, quote, totally in its primal origin, the fullness of this, end quote, which is expressed by means of adjectival words. For Rosenzweig, another way of describing this fullness is to call it chaos, what he calls the first sling of creation. In fact, the world is not created until this existence, this chaos, is first called into existence. And existence in its universality and all-embracing formfulness remains the immediate created ground, the beginning out of which the ever-new births of the fullness shoot forth. No chaos, no creation, no world. The fullness as chaos is its transitory appearance as particular existence, which is also the first utterance we can make about the world's existence. There's also an ethical significance for Rosenzweig's grammatical analogy in how the very existence of the world corresponds to the root word of creation, the primal yes, or the yes, that he interprets as an affirmative and evaluative good, uttered in judgment upon completion of a creation. It is an estimational judgment, an estimating judgment, that logically occurs before the fullness, before the chaos of adjective words. And thus, according to Rosenzweig's linguistic account for creation, quote, chaos is in creation, not before it. The beginning is in the beginning, end quote, which is the act of creation. Rosenzweig is critical of idealist kinds of aesthetics because of how those philosophies contend that we should only think about the world in which we live in terms of a deductive logic that presupposes both a rationally defined source and a rationally defined goal. That kind of thinking is problematically based on a principle of generation, whereby a succession of particulars identical to the original generator is produced, and that has a built-in teleologic goal of an ordered cosmos. Rosenzweig's concept of creation, by contrast, itself reveals an ordered cosmos, but does not entail either a rational connection between the world and its creator, or the presupposition of an ultimately ordered cosmos, except for the fact of the act of creation itself. Rosenzweig tells us that creation includes, by definition, an anarchic dimension, since, as an event that is freely produced, it is not set in a previously ordered horizon determined by this or that principle. For idealist philosophers, quote, generation should accomplish the same as creation. It should give to the plastic, objective world, the world as antiquity saw it, the point from which its multiplicity closes together and orders itself in unity, end quote. By positing the concept of a creator whose only relation to the world is that of having created it, we're able to think of a created world as being separate and thus having picturability and plastic self-containedness, aesthetic traits already also elaborated in antiquity. Given a concept of a God that is not so inextricably bound up in managing the laws of the world, allows us to represent to ourselves a picture of a world that is not chained to a causal determinism that would undermine the basic insights of standard empirical philosophy or the possibility of radical ethical freedom. In Rosenzweig's model, we are given the conditions that enable us to imagine a sense of ourselves in a world in which we are able to freely act and to create new things and new relationships. In order to further differentiate the phenomenon of speech thinking from the generative logic of idealist thinking, Rosenzweig uses garden imagery to suggest how language is rooted in the primal words, yet grows and flourishes in its actualization in human relations. It grows and renews itself because language is a kind of living and growing art form, in the way that language and life mutually nourish each other. It is precisely this point that distinguishes Rosenzweig's philosophy of language from an idealist or analytic philosophy of language. Where an idealist or analytic philosophy of language contends that all forms of human speech can be reduced to symbolic designators and algebraic formulas, Rosenzweig contends that doing so robs language of its rootedness in its sensuality and its ability to transform humans through its transsensuality, transforming them from tragically isolated selves to existing, colorful, soundful souls able to touch and move each other. That happens as the dialogical process of revelation, the theme for the next chapter. Proleptically, however, here in this book, the work of creation thinking shows that because idealist thinking lost contact with the living vitality of unpredictable existence and was, quote, sunk down in the under and pre-world shadow realm of logic, it had to seek and to hold open an access to the overworld, end quote. It sought this access because it had lost trust in language, since it was not the work of its own hands. Acting from the spur of a guilty conscience, idealists needed another supposition to mediate and thereby confirm the dynamics of reality. A substitution that had to be a human garden, in which humans themselves plant the structures of mediation, but which retains the character of unconsciously arising as if without human involvement. That was art. Art became the vehicle for idealist philosophers to visibly and empirically justify their need for methodological completeness in their pan-logistic ordering of reality. The artwork provides the visible proof of an absolute verification of certainty that one's roots are drinking from the reality of the all, and therefore quells the doubts that dwell at the root of all idealist philosophical undertakings. Hence, instead of believing in the, quote, speech of the soul, which is a self-revelation of human innerness that encompasses, supports, and completes all other self-expression, end quote, an idealist trusts merely in art itself, in one torn-off limb of humanity. But for Rosenzweig, what it means to become fully human is precisely to become ensouled, which means accepting that a human life is not, in essence, a work of art, even though without that limb, humans would be crippled. Without art, a human would still remain human. But without the spoken word of language, which testifies to a human soul, a human ceases being fully human. And then I was going to provide some more pictures of a vital human with the kind of vitalizing picture of a soul. I didn't know how I'd think this up. But also then one with the torn off limb, perhaps a torn out larynx or something. Still human, perhaps. Just as creation can be said to be only the beginning in the framework of world time, so the creation of an artwork is only the beginning of the work of humans in the world, and the beginning of the effects of the work itself through time. Involved in understanding the formative process of a work is also the effect of the work on the viewer. Returning again to speech, Rosenzweig tells us that the present effect is also the revelatory effect, and that has to do with language. Indeed, Rosenzweig distinguishes between spoken language as such and, quote, the living, streaming actuality of actual speech, end quote, in order to highlight the difference between grasping the intention and expression of a speech act and the actual effects of its becoming or its completion in the other, in the viewer. We only see the beginning in creation, but not the ongoing or completed life of the work. That entails revelation. Only in the revelatory saying of actual living, streaming language is human content able to be expressed by way of the artwork. What is exposed or freely brought out in the, quote, life day of the work of art, end quote, in the execution of building up a work of art are individuals. These individuals take the form of a kingdom of details, the adjectives in this case, that emerge from a pre-aesthetic totality in a historical procession from the ground concepts to an aesthetically rich actuality. Rosenzweig identified for us three foundational examples of such productions in part one, done by his own hand: God as mythic, world as plastic, and human as tragic. Towards the end of this chapter, we are given three different examples when Rosenzweig introduces the sections on genius, poet, and artist in the Star. These categories connect Rosenzweig's theoretical discourse in part one with his practical demonstrations in part two, especially with how he interprets biblical texts as exemplifying how creative acts are tied up with language and established narratives. Rosenzweig first tells us that the creation of the artwork happens in the author, using the word Urheber for author. He wants us to think of the activity of the genius as author in terms of one who draws something up or out of an already existing reservoir, out of the primal depths and wealth of one's own pre-existing reservoir, of one's own autonomously developed substance. Rosenzweig names this state being already created, the author as being already created. He points out that the happening of the work of art and its relation to the viewer depends on the viewer for its completion, a completion that is measured by its degree of actual liveliness. This provides an important part in Rosenzweig's theory for the role of art as cultural and political phenomenon. As one of the criteria for measuring that actual effectiveness of a work of art, the liveliness, it's a proleptic, by the way, part, as one of the criteria for measuring the actual effectiveness of a work of art, the liveliness is that aspect of the work that is capable of arousing a feeling of common humanity in others. That is, liveliness presupposes that there is another human other than myself who, through that work, awakens me as I awaken her by way of experiencing a lively feeling of our common sense of humanity. That awoken feeling then initiates a process within the other, which leads to the formation of self-identities, as souls, by the way, through instigating a process of self-reflexivity, initially based on the formation of a perceived sense of commonality. That commonality is that the other is like me and shares a human commonality with me, but that, in the next instance, is negated in order to allow for one's own sense of self-affirmation to be renewed. In order to better elucidate his ideas about this matter of self-identity, Rosenzweig turns to an ideal case, namely the case of the genius and the eruptive act by which someone becomes marked as a genius by an evaluating public. The issue of the genius is not new with Rosenzweig, but instead indicates its roots in the German idealist preoccupation with using such a term to categorize extraordinary works of human production. But Rosenzweig, for his part, rejects the assumption that only an elite, predetermined few in a process of natural selection have been selected or predetermined to become geniuses. He argues that if geniuses were born to inevitably become geniuses, then the category of personality would provide the criteria to determine who is or is not a genius. Whereas personality, as we learned from Book 2 and Part 1, which we didn't consider, whereas personality is simply that determination of a human being which results from cultural and environmental determinations and not genetic heritage. Instead, the category of genius for Rosenzweig is tied to the category of self, and to become a self is open to almost everyone. Quote, miracle children have just as much as, or just as little chance to become a genius as any other human, end quote. Just as a self, quote, suddenly surprises someone one day, so genius surprises someone one day, end quote. What is common between the genius and every other self is that both presuppose a pre-existing totality of human being, whereas what differentiates the genius from every other self is that the genius, drawing on his or her, quote, complex of ingenious characteristics, end quote, which constitute its own most self, is able to draw from within him or herself and set free a work. It now becomes apparent how important the earlier analysis of freedom, caprice, and necessity is for Rosenzweig's position. Being able to draw from within oneself and to set free a work is that which constitutes the difference between genius and non-genius, and not personality as such. Rosenzweig expands that definition of genius, or author, to include every human being capable of becoming a self, but restricts members of that set to those who are capable of, quote, increasing and completing oneself within oneself, end quote. What this means is that the genius is able to begin a new beginning, because the emergence of genius, with respect to personality and self, is the beginning of a new phase in one's life. But for Rosenzweig, the true genius has to become a poet. as opposed to being just an artist, since every genius is an artist, but not every artist is a genius. This means that the genius has to have access to, quote, an inner manifoldness, a world of creations, of imaginative insights and thoughts, which harmoniously strive towards each other in simply being with one another, end quote. Rosenzweig calls this harmonious inner striving towards each other of coexisting thoughts family resemblances, a concept that connects his ideas about art with the ethical relationship of dialogue developed later in Part 2, and instrumental in his social theory of responsibility that he develops in Part 3. He also notes that unless one is capable of inexhaustibly producing new creations out of this covenant of family relations, then one is a crippled genius. It seems that the life of the genius, although open to everyone, is actually very demanding and extraordinarily complex. Finally, Rosenzweig ends the chapter with his midrashic interpretation of the opening passages of Bereshit. In exercising his midrash, it becomes clear that he does not negate or reject art or mathematics, which would then be submitting to the inexorable appropriation of a dialectical logic, something he forswears. Rather, he proceeds phenomenologically by taking art and mathematics as presuppositions, and proceeds by building their transformation from static placeholders in a metaphysical sort of logical atomism, whose power is the analysis of the individual point, into the building stones for a story which descriptively reveals that which is believed to be a dynamic, self-renewing course of actually emerging creations and relations of constituent parts, of those constituent parts. The hypothetical and isolated elements are withdrawn from within the author and assembled to form a philosophical, theological, sociological narrative that makes ethical and thus corresponding sense of the different elements in the narrative. It is also ethical because ethical relations depend on establishing relations of believing trust in the language that comes naturally to us. In Rosenzweig's words, quote, we describe the course in which we believe with the words in which we trust, end quote. But which words should we trust? Which do we believe in? And where do such words come from? What do we mean when we talk about such trust? Well, for Rosenzweig, we trust because we are accustomed to using something based on our faith in its reliability and familiarity. Rosenzweig tells us that it's necessary to trust language, which is easy because of its utter familiarity. We trust in that language that resounds for us with a sense for familiar, joyful, and fruitful relations, and that bridges our inner radically subjective experience with our objective experiences of others in, with, and of the world. Simply put, what we hear from the other is what we intuitively say from our own hearts. That means that even though the inner structural processes for constructing the elements God, world, human can be and should continue to be differentiated, Rosenzweig asserts that, quote, the word of God and the word of the human are the same, end quote, in how they resound with actuality for us. At this end chapter, what Rosenzweig means by that is simply an experience of a speech act, referring to that one who at one time created something out of nothing, as an act about which we continue to speak. And I have one short paragraph to conclude. And this is, I'm very unhappy with this because as I mentioned to Zina at lunch, it has to do with me attempting to deal with the very end of that chapter as the transition to her presentation. So, and that has to do with this concept of death, right? So this is the very important end of creation. Creation built in, death is built into creation. We continue to speak not only because to create is good, but because it is very good. As Rosenzweig tells us at the conclusion of his midrash on the creation story, the inclusion of the very intensifier of very. Yeah. No. With the ethically intended speech act good indicates that within the profusive chaotic origins of creation itself is the death of each
particular creation. What it means to be, essentially, is to be finite, ephemeral, transitory, mortal. Strange